Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Story Villa. Tonight, we journey into the icy wilderness of America's final frontier, with 10 of the most chilling true Alaskan ghost town horror accounts. These are not mere legends or folklore whispered through generations. They are documented cases, drawn from police files, personal journals, survivor testimonies, and long-buried government records, sealed away for decades. From the monster-haunted ruins of Portlock, where an entire community fled in terror, to the frozen graves of Kennecott, where corporate secrets remain trapped in the permafrost. Each story tonight represents a fragment of real horror that officials never wanted exposed. We will uncover mining tragedies hidden beneath layers of deceit, government experiments that spiraled fatally out of control, and encounters with forces that compelled entire towns to walk away from everything they had ever built in Alaska's remote wilderness. If you're joining us for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to Story Villa for daily explorations of true horror that will leave you questioning what truly happens where civilization collides with the raw unknown. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness stirs. And if you'd like to support my work of unearthing these forbidden accounts, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, let us descend into the nightmares preserved within Alaska's permafrost, where the cold can kill, but the truth cuts deeper. What I'm about to share comes from a leather-bound journal I discovered at an estate sale in Anchorage. The seller explained it had belonged to her grandfather, Marcus Beaumont, one of Portlock's final residents. She refused to discuss why she was partying with his belongings. But when I opened the book and read the first entry, dated March 15, 1949, it became clear why she could no longer keep it in her possession. Marcus's handwriting was elegant, the kind taught in early 20th century classrooms. At first, his notes were unremarkable weather complaints, comments on the salmon runs, observations of neighbors in what was still a thriving cannery town on the southern edge of the Kenai Peninsula. But as the pages went on, his writing grew more frantic, his entries darker, and their contents capable of haunting any reader. The first unsettling passage appeared on April 2, 1949. Marcus wrote, "Something has been watching the town from the tree line for 3 days. Old Peter Vosnikov was the first to see it standing, about 8 feet tall, draped in dark hair, just past the cannery. When Peter shouted, it vanished instantly, as though it had never existed. Yet he swore. Its yellow eyes glared back at us, studying us, calculating something no man should wish to comprehend. I spent months digging into Portlock's history, and what I uncovered in official documents conflicted with Marcus's terrifying account. According to government records, Portlock's decline was slow, triggered by economic hardships and the completion of the Sterling Highway, which made other communities easier to reach. By 1950, the post office was shut down, and residents drifted toward native villages like Nanwelek and Port Graham. But Marcus's journal painted a completely different picture. April 8, 1949. Jimmy Hobson went hunting and never returned. Normally, this wouldn't have raised alarm. Jimmy knew those woods better than anyone. He had been tracking moose along a creek bed near the ruins of an old Russian church when his wife, Mary, heard a scream, not a cry for help, but a blood-curdling shriek of raw terror that echoed across the valley. Days later, the search party discovered his rifle, bent in half, as though folded like paper. No trace of Jimmy was ever found. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus documented 3 more disappearances. Each search uncovered evidence of violent struggles, shredded clothing, splintered tools, earth torn apart, but never a body. Instead, there were tracks. April 20th, 1949. Enormous prints pressed deep into the mud, each 18 inches long, bearing 5 toes and what appeared to be claws. Thomas Larson examined them, calculating that whatever left them weighed at least 600 pounds, and walked upright. But no human bore feet that size, and no bear ever left tracks like these. The elders named it Ninok, the old Elutic word for the hairy one who steals people. Their grandparents had spoken of it, though most dismissed those tales as children's warnings against wandering too far. Marcus's descriptions matched fragments I uncovered from other testimonies, but his words carried details never included in official accounts. The creature was not merely abducting, it was watching, analyzing, adapting to the villagers' movements, their habits, their weaknesses. April 25, 1949. Last night, rocks were hurled at the Hendrickson house for over an hour. Not pebbles, but boulders, massive stones, the size of melons, that thundered against the walls and roof. At dawn, Emil Hendrickson ventured outside and discovered the rocks had been arranged into a flawless circle surrounding his home, as though marking territory. At the circle's center lay a pile of belongings, the personal effects of every missing villager. Jimmy's hunting knife, Sarah Nilsson's ribbon, Frank Peterson's tobacco pouch. It was as if the thing was keeping trophies and it wanted us to know. By May of 1949, Marcus's writing showed a town drowning in fear. No one dared leave their homes after nightfall, and even in daylight, the woods were avoided at all costs. Cannery workers refused to travel to distant fishing sites, and entire families began abandoning the settlement, leaving on the monthly supply boats. May 3, 1949, marked the beginning of the end. Albert Petka tried to resist it. He was a hardened old Russian, one of the first men in Portlock since the cannery had opened back in 1921, when the creature came for his dogs. Albert didn't hesitate. He grabbed an axe in one hand and a rifle in the other and went after it. Around midnight, we heard the gunfire echoing through the trees. A few moments later, the sharp cracks of gunshots gave way to Albert's terrible screams, and then only silence. By morning, when we reached his yard, we found him broken, on the ground, his chest crushed inward, though he still clung to life. He lived just long enough to tell us what had attacked him. He swore it was not an ordinary animal, but it wasn't human either. It walked upright on two legs like a man, but its body was covered in thick, coarse black hair, and its face was wrong, too long, too primal. Its jaw lined with teeth like a wolf's. Albert said it moved far faster than anything that size had any right to move. And worse, it was intelligent. It had used his dogs as bait, knowing Albert's devotion would draw him outside. Not long after Albert Petka succumbed to his wounds, the remaining townsfolk of Portlock gathered in the cannery foreman's office. According to Marcus Beaumont's journal, only 23 adults remained, with a scattering of children. It was then, May 10, 1949, that they made the choice that would end Portlock as a settlement forever. The vote was unanimous. Everyone would leave on the next supply ship, expected within 2 weeks. Some planned to resettle in Port Graham or Soldovia. Others dreamed of moving far away to places like Seattle or Vancouver unwhere. But here, though no one wanted to admit it outright, the truth was clear. It wasn't just the vanishings, or even Albert's brutal death driving them away. They all understood the same thing, that whatever prowled the forest would never stop until the last of them was gone. It was studying them, striking with increasing boldness, growing more confident and ruthless. Asterisk if they stayed. Their fates would be no different than Jimmy Hobson's, and the others just more names on the grim list of those who walked into the Alaskan wilds and never returned. Yet the most chilling entry in Marcus's journal wasn't about the creature's violence, but what came after their decision to abandon the town. On May 15, 1949, Marcus wrote that the thing somehow knew. He couldn't fathom how it might understand human plans or intentions, but he was certain it did. That night, it had walked right into pausing in the middle of their dirt road that passed for Main Street. Mrs. Davidson had watched it from her window, describing how it stood there nearly an hour, its head turning deliberately from house to house as if counting them. When the moon slid behind a cloud and the street was swallowed in darkness, the figure slipped away. At dawn, they found something that turned their stomachs cold, scratched into the dirt, Before every single house was the same strange symbol, a circle with rays stretching outward, like the sun. The elders recognized it as an old Aleut sign, meaning watching or waiting. It was as though the creature itself was sending them a message, that even once they fled, it would not forget them. The final pages of Marcus Beaumont's journal were written aboard the supply vessel that carried the last souls out of Portlock later that May. His handwriting returned to its orderly precision, as though leaving that cursed ground restored some calm to him. On May 28th, he wrote of looking back at Port Chatham Bay. Already the town looked forsaken, though they had only departed hours before. He thought the forest seemed to press closer, swallowing the houses, and swore he glimpsed something massive slipping between the trees near the old Russian Orthodox church. Captain Morrison said he'd return in 6 months for a final supply run, either to recover stragglers or salvage. Marcus urged him not to waste his time. Some places, yet Marcus did not end his account there. One last entry, dated November 15, 1949, described what happened when Morrison ignored his plea. When the captain returned from Portlock, his face was ashen, his lips tight with horror, and he swore he would never go back. Only after heavy drink at the Solovia Inn did he share what he had seen. The town was wrecked, not eroded by weather or abandoned decay, but deliberately destroyed by immense force. Roofs had been wrenched off and hurled into the forest, walls torn through as if by monstrous fists. Cannery machines weighing tons were toppled and scattered like children's toys. Most grotesque of all, in the heart of Main Street, the creature had built something, some kind of structure fashioned from shattered timbers and household debris, arranged in a geometric design that strained the eyes to look upon. At its center lay a pile of bones, human bones, laid out in the same sunburst circle they had seen outside the Hendrickson home. Morrison counted at least a dozen skulls. He believed the missing townsfolk of those final months had been kept alive somewhere, prisoners of the thing, only to be slaughtered all at once when the last residents left, their remains twisted into a macabre monument. Morrison confessed he felt eyes watching him from the forest the entire time, though he never saw the beast. He fled before it caught him too. I shut Marcus Beaumont's journal after reading those words and sat in silence, unable to shake the weight of it. The account was too consistent, too detailed, too chilling to be mere fantasy or campfire tale. More importantly, it explained why official records of Portlock's abandonment were vague, contradictory, and incomplete. Who would believe such a story? How could authorities file a report on something that fit no category of animal, human, or natural disaster? It was simpler to say Portlock had failed for economic reasons or changes in shipping. Yet I couldn't let go of Captain Morrison's testimony, or what his final visit revealed. If Marcus's journal told the truth, then the ruins of that fishing village hid evidence of one of the most sinister mass killings in American history. Worse, it meant the creature that caused it was still alive, still somewhere in that wilderness. I dug into the lives of the survivors who had escaped in 1949, hoping for closure. Instead, I found more shadows. Over the following decade, death seemed to stalk them. Hunters mauled in areas where bears weren't known to be aggressive, fishermen vanishing without a trace, bodies never recovered. Even Marcus himself met a grim end in 1957 while staying with family in Port Graham. The coroner wrote heart attack on the certificate, but his nephew later told investigators his body bore massive blunt trauma, as if struck with crushing force. He also claimed Marcus had been paranoid in his final days, convinced something was following him, watching from the trees. Perhaps Marcus had been delusional, weaving an elaborate myth around Portlock's decline. Perhaps the official records told the truth, that the town simply dwindled under economic strain, abandoned for more practical settlements. But as I held that leather-bound journal in my hands, running my fingers over the careful, frantic writing, I could not dismiss it. It felt real. Too real. Like a record of something the world was never meant to know. Somewhere out in the ruins of Portlock, Alaska, the truth waits, buried beneath time and silence. and somewhere in the vast, unyielding Kenai Peninsula, something that once hunted men 75 years ago may still linger watching, waiting, and remembering the taste of terror that drove a town to vanish. The thought that disturbs me most is not whether Marcus spoke the truth, but whether that thing ever truly left, or whether it remains there, still raising monuments of bones to warn away intruders, still keeping its dominion in the shadows of the Alaskan wilds. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. A woman's sobbing voice trembled over the line. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said. "I need to tell someone what really happened to my great-uncle in Kennecott before I lose my nerve." I had been chronicling the haunted remnants of Alaskan ghost towns for 3 years, but something in Sarah's voice struck me cold. It carried a weight, a desperation that only comes from secrets borne too long. "Take your time," I told her gently, settling in at my desk, recorder running. "Tell me everything." Her breathing steadied. My great-uncle was Thomas Mitchell. He worked for the Kennecott Copper Company in the 1930s, until they shut down the mine in 1938. But what I'm about to share never made it into the official reports. The company buried it. She paused, and I heard the rustle of pages. "I found his journal 3 months ago while cleaning out my grandmother's attic. She lived to 96, and just before she died, she gripped my hand and whispered, 'Sarah, find Tommy's journal. Tell them what really happened to those boys.' I didn't understand until I read it. The entries began simply," she explained. "Thomas arrived in Kennecott in 1935, working as a foreman in the Bonanza mine. Though the operation was winding down, there was still copper to be pulled, tunnels to maintain. Then came the first troubling entry, dated October 15, 1935. Thomas described a new shaft uncovered on the mountain's northern side. The crews called it the Midnight Tunnel, since only the night shift dared work it. Daytime miners refused to go near it. That shaft had been revealed by a dynamite blast that broke into a natural cavern sprawling deep inside the mountain. The copper seams there were richer than anything yet discovered, but there was something stranger. The cavern had already been mined, long ago, not with machines, but with picks and shovels. They found old lanterns, tools, relics that looked like they came from the 1880s or earlier. Yet there were no claims, no records, no history of mining in that spot. The company itself had purchased the land directly from the government, with nothing filed before. Soon, workers began reporting eerie sounds from the midnight tunnel, rhythmic tapping, like pickaxes on stone. Sometimes voices. But when they searched, the chambers were empty save for the scattered old tools, lying about as if freshly dropped. The company sent in investigators, but these were no ordinary inspectors. They wore suits, carried briefcases, and spent 3 days in the depths with their instruments and cameras. When they emerged, new orders came down. Seal the midnight tunnel at once. No reasons given. But Thomas Mitchell's curiosity got the better of him. On the final night before it was to be closed forever, he went down into the shaft alone. Sarah's voice grew quieter as she read the journal's words dated November 3rd, 1935. I must write while the memory is sharp, because part of me already wishes I could forget. I carried 3 lanterns, yet the blackness seemed to devour their glow. The deeper I went, the louder the tapping, then the voices. They spoke English, but old-fashioned, their accents strange, their words decades out of date, talking about seams, copper loads, and a superintendent who would not let them rest. I followed the voices until the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. My light could not reach the far walls. Equipment was everywhere, shovels or carts, pickaxes set out as if work had paused only hours ago. And then I saw them. According to Thomas's account, he found the bodies of at least 30 men in that cavern. These were no fresh deaths, preserved by the mountain's cold. Their clothes and tools marked them as miners from the 1880s. They lay as if they had merely lying down to rest, some with picks still in their hands. Some gathered around a darkened fire. Their faces, he wrote, looked peaceful, as though they had finally been allowed to sleep. Sarah paused, voice trembling again, before continuing. But that was not the most terrifying part. As Uncle Tommy examined the site, he became aware of footsteps echoing behind him. When he spun around, he saw 3 men emerging from the darkness, steadily approaching. They were dressed in miner's gear from the 1880s, and each carried a lantern that gave off no glow at all. According to Thomas's journal, the figures came forward calmly, showing no trace of surprise at his presence. The eldest, a gray-bearded man with gentle eyes, spoke in a voice that seemed to drift from a distant place. He introduced himself as Charles Brennan, the superintendent of the very first copper mining operation in that region. He told Thomas that since 1882, he and his crew had worked those tunnels, but tragedy had struck. A collapse had sealed them inside, and they had perished slowly in the darkness, waiting for help that never came. Charles Brennan explained that they had remained tied to the mine ever since, unable to rest until the copper was properly removed and the tunnels secured for others. They were the ones behind the tapping noises and disembodied voices, the restless spirits of miners still carrying out their final shift. Uncle Tommy asked why there were no records of their operation, why history had forgotten them. Charles Brennan revealed that the company had been operating illegally, with no government permits or legal claims. When the men vanished, it was more convenient for everyone involved to pretend they had never existed. But Brennan had one last. The Kennecott Corporation had long been aware of them. The company had found the bodies years earlier, but concealed the discovery to avoid trouble with its own ventures. The suited investigators who had come to the midnight tunnel were not searching for copper at all. They were ensuring that the earlier mine and the deaths of 30 men would stay hidden. Charles Brennan warned Tommy that the company planned to seal the tunnel with dynamite, burying their remains forever. He begged Tommy to tell their story, to give them a proper burial, to let the world know what had really happened. Thomas Mitchell promised Brennan he would try, but when he returned to the surface and attempted to report his findings, he discovered the company had already anticipated such a move. The following morning, Thomas was summoned to the supervisor's office and abruptly informed he was being transferred to the company's Arizona operation. A replacement had already been assigned to Alaska. He was given just 24 hours to pack and board a ship to Seattle. When he asked about the midnight tunnel, the supervisor coldly told him it had been sealed the previous night for safety reasons. He also warned that miners who spread tales of hazards or ghosts often found themselves blacklisted in the industry. Sarah's tone grew sharp as she spoke. Uncle Tommy recognized the threat, with a wife and 2 children depending on him. He accepted the transfer and never dared speak publicly about what he had seen in the midnight tunnel. But he carried the memory of those 30 men until the end of his life. For the rest of his career, Thomas Mitchell searched for ways to keep his promise to Charles Brennan. He wrote letters to officials, contacted newspapers, even reached out to historical societies. Yet the Kennecott Corporation had been thorough in erasing all traces of the earlier operation. There were no records, no missing person files, no relatives seeking men who had never existed. Sarah said the later journal entries were heartbreaking. Uncle Tommy described nightmares where he still heard the tapping from beneath the sealed rock. He dreamt of Charles Brennan asking why he had broken his promise. The guilt consumed him. Thomas Mitchell died in 1967, taking the secret to his grave, but left instructions that his journal be passed down in hopes someone would tell the story he never could. I have been digging into this for months, Sarah said. She had contacted the National Park Service, historians, and mining experts. And do you know what I found? Nothing. No trace of any such mining operation before Kennecott. No missing miners from the 1880s. No Charles Brennan on any official list. Still, she persisted, using modern genealogical tools. Sarah traced a Charles Brennan who had indeed worked in various Western mines during the 1880s, vanishing in 1882 while prospecting copper in Alaska Territory. His wife had filed a missing person report, but he was never recovered. Sarah uncovered records of 6 other miners lost in the same area during that year. Each had been employed by small, independent outfits that soon folded after the men disappeared. All their vanishings were dismissed as wanderers, moving on without word. Even more disturbing was what Sarah found in the Kennecott Corporation archives. Though much of the company's history had been donated to libraries, there was a 20-year gap spanning 1918 to 1938. Officially, those files had been destroyed in a Seattle warehouse fire in 1955. But Sarah checked the insurance records. There had been no fire. Kennecott had deliberately destroyed the files. "And I think I know why," she said. Uncle Tommy wasn't the only one who knew about the bodies. The company covered it up for decades. By the time Sarah finished, I realized I believed her. The details were far too intricate, too consistent, too haunted by human emotion to be invention, and the pattern matched other corporate cover-ups from that era. Seed transfers, veiled threats, records erased. "I'm calling you because I don't know where else to turn," Sarah concluded. "I made a promise to my grandmother, and through her, to Uncle Tommy, and to Charles Brennan. Those 30 miners deserve their story told. They deserve remembrance. And maybe if enough people know, someone with the means can give them the burial they never had." After she hung up, I sat in silence, thinking of the tale. The Kennecott mine had been shut for over 80 years, now a protected landmark. The Midnight Tunnel, if it existed, lay buried beneath tons of ice and stone. But late at night, I remember Thomas Mitchell's journal and Brennan's plea. Somewhere in the frozen Alaskan mountains, 30 miners may still be waiting. And perhaps even now, they are still tapping in the darkness, still trying to finish their final shift. Professor Elena Rodriguez thought she was pursuing a straightforward history paper on the Chilkoot Trail. But in interviewing descendants of Daya survivors, she uncovered what official records had hidden. What she learned would change everything we thought we knew about the deadliest catastrophe of the Klondike Gold Rush, and why an entire town vanished from the maps. Alina had taught Alaskan history at the University of Alaska, Anchorage, for 15 years when she began using her sabbatical to research the Palm Sunday avalanche of April 3, 1898. Official reports described 60 to 70 prospectors killed when multiple avalanches struck near a site called the Scales. A tragic, if simple, case of nature crushing human ambition in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. But Alina believed official accounts only scratched the surface. She sought the human voices behind the numbers, the stories that breathed life into tragedy. She reached out to genealogical groups, family historians, and descendants who might still hold letters, diaries, or oral traditions from that fateful spring. The first anomaly came in a letter from Margaret Thompson, whose great-great-grandfather had run a supply shop in Daya during the rush. "Dear Professor Rodriguez Margaret Roach, I've been tracing my family's history for 20 years, and I found something troubling about the avalanche. My ancestor James Thompson wrote in his journal that the slide wasn't entirely natural. I know this sounds unbelievable, but I have documents you should see." Alina arranged to visit Margaret in Wasilla, where she examined a cache of papers passed down through 5 generations. The central piece was James Thompson's ledger, which doubled as his diary. The 1898 entries described a community driven by greed, rivalry, and desperation. February 15, 1898, Alina read from the worn pages. "The Harriman Consortium has been surveying avalanche zones above the Scales for 3 weeks. They claim to be planning safety measures for their transport venture, but I've seen them placing charges in spots that would trigger slides. When I confronted their foreman, he told me to keep quiet if I wanted their business." Alina glanced up. "Who is the Harriman Consortium?" Margaret pulled out a folder of clippings. It had taken her years to trace them. They were Seattle investors backing a tramway system on the Chilkoot Trail, locked in competition with the Chilkoot Railroad and Transport Company, which was racing to complete another route. Whoever finished first would control all freight to the Klondike goldfields. It was valued at a staggering fortune. Helena pressed on with James Thompson's journal. The entries from March of 1898, revealing escalating friction between rival companies and mounting fear among Daya residents over the deadly contest unfolding on the mountain above town. March 8, 1898. 3 more workers from the CRNT company vanished near the weighing scales yesterday. Their foreman insisted they deserted, chasing prospecting parties traveling north, but their possessions remain in their tents, and their wages went uncollected. Thomas McKinnon, who hauls supplies up the pass, confided to me that he spotted armed guards from both companies prowling the work zones after dark. This is no longer about tramway construction. This has turned into a war, and it will be the innocent stampeders who pay the price. Yet the most harrowing entry bore the date March 30th, only days before the infamous Palm Sunday avalanche. March 30th, 1898. I have learned something that freezes my blood. Jonathan Hartwell, a surveyor employed by the Harriman Consortium, stumbled into my store drunk and distraught tonight. He confessed that his company had been preparing to unleash a controlled avalanche meant to obliterate CRNT's work sites and wipe out their crews entirely. For weeks they have been planting dynamite within the snowpack, biding time until the weather cooperates. But Hartwell realized the avalanche will be far more catastrophic than they intended, racing down the entire mountainside and crushing hundreds of stampeders caught on the trail. He begged me to send word to the authorities in Skagway, but I told him any warning would arrive far too late. Helena lowered the journal, her eyes fixed on Margaret. This amounted to an accusation that the Harriman Consortium deliberately engineered the Palm Sunday avalanche. That would mean mass murder, not natural disaster. Margaret's face was grim. Keep reading. It gets worse. Helena turned the page to April 3rd, 1898, the day itself. April 3rd, 1898. Events unfolded just as Hartwell foretold. Avalanches thundered before dawn and continued for hours, but these were not spontaneous slides caused by instability. I heard the explosions resound across the peaks, deliberate detonations unleashing waves of snow and ice directly where the CRNT men labored. By midday, at least 60 souls were dead, every last rival worker among them. The Harriman Consortium had destroyed their competition and cleared the field for. Yet Thompson's account revealed something even darker. The avalanche had been timed to coincide with Daya's weekly supply caravan, when the trail teemed with stampeders hauling gold back to civilization. April 4th, 1898. Now I see the true magnitude of this crime. While rescuers clawed through the drifts, seeking survivors, Harriman men methodically stripped the corpses and scattered camps of valuables. They carried away thousands in gold, insisting it was salvage from the wreckage. When families inquired after belongings, they were told everything lay buried too deep or swept away by later slides. Helena lifted her gaze from the page. Was any of this ever reported to the authorities? Margaret opened another folder. That is where the story turns even darker. Letters from families reveal James Thompson attempted to tell the U.S. Marshal in Skagway, but on arriving for the meeting, he was informed the Marshal had been suddenly reassigned to Seattle. His deputy, William Harrison, took the meeting instead, and Harrison, according to Seattle Incorporation records I uncovered, was a silent partner of the Harriman Consortium. Over the following months, Helena traced descendants of Daya families and found the same disturbing pattern repeated again and again. Letters, testimonies, and preserved documents pointed to the avalanche as an intentional massacre orchestrated by ruthless businessmen who sacrificed lives to protect their claims in the Klondike trade. The most damning material came from the descendants of Dr. Charles Woodruff, Daya's unofficial physician, preserved by his granddaughter in Juneau. were his medical notes, containing autopsy details that completely contradicted the official findings. Dozens of victims bore wounds inflicted before being buried, gunshots, knife cuts, crushing blows to skull and chest. At least 20, he wrote, were murdered prior to the snowslide. He tried to submit his findings to territorial officials, but was warned that pressing further would cost him his medical license. Soon after, Woodruff was forced from Alaska. His thriving practice in Dyea transferred to another physician with financial ties to Harriman, who amended the death certificates, declaring every victim dead from exposure and suffocation in an unavoidable natural disaster. Perhaps the most damning revelation Alina unearthed was buried within the Harriman Consortium's own corporate archives. A Seattle law firm donated the firm's records to the University of Washington in 1975, and Alina spent weeks sifting through their contents. Among the correspondence was a letter dated March 15, 1898, from consortium leader Edward Harriman himself. The CRNT company must be neutralized before they complete their tramway. Our engineers are confident a sequence of detonations can unleash snowslides appearing entirely natural, while fulfilling our objectives. The cost will be heavy, but the profits of monopolizing Chilkoot traffic outweigh all necessary expenditures. Even more chilling was a follow-up memo dated April 5th, 2 days after the disaster. Project Snowslide has concluded successfully. All CR&T personnel eradicated, construction destroyed. Salvage yielded approximately $47,000 in gold and materials. Trail traffic can be diverted to our route within 6 weeks, ensuring our total control of freight into the Klondike. Records further showed extensive bribes paid to territorial officials to suppress inquiry. A ledger in April of 1898 documented $15,000 in so-called administrative expenses and investigation mitigation. The cover-up was complete and airtight within half a year. The Harriman Consortium had finished their tramway and secured a stranglehold on freight transport between Dyea and the Klondike. CR&T collapsed, its investors ruined. The avalanche offered the perfect pretext for the disappearance of dozens of inconvenient witnesses to the consortium's crimes. But Elena's research proved the conspiracy stretched further, sealing the fate of Dyea itself. As whispers of the avalanche's true cause spread among survivors, fear took hold. Families feared not just avalanches but the powerful men who had proven willing to slaughter hundreds for profit. A June 1898 letter from Sarah McKinnon to her sister in Seattle captured their dread. "We cannot remain. Too many know the truth, and too many accidents have silenced those who speak. James Thompson's store burned last week with him trapped inside. Dr. Woodruff fled after receiving death threats. The avalanche was only the beginning. These men will kill anyone who endangers their enterprise, and we know what they can do." Elena's investigation showed the exodus from Dyea accelerated in 1898 and 1899, not from declining commerce as official histories claimed, but because the town had been systematically terrorized by families who might have rebuilt chose instead to flee, carrying with them knowledge of a massacre disguised as misfortune. By 1900, Dyea's thriving population of over 8,000 had dwindled to fewer than 500. The post office closed, businesses failed, and the town slid into abandonment. The Harriman Consortium, their goals achieved, shifted operations to Skagway, and later sold their transport assets to larger railroad firms. Elena concluded her research with heavy sorrow and fury. The Palm Sunday avalanche was no act of nature, it was a calculated slaughter engineered to eliminate rivals and plunder fortunes in gold. 60 to 70 innocents perished, not because of snowpack instability, but because men of wealth judged human life expendable in pursuit of dominance. Most chilling of all was the realization that their cover-up endured. For a century, history books repeated the tale of an unlucky natural disaster. The victims remembered only as dreamers who perished chasing gold, rather than as casualties of corporate murder. Alina attempted to publish her findings in academic journals, but was repeatedly dismissed. Editors argued her claims were speculative, her charges too serious without stronger proof, and warned her work could damage Alaska's tourism if made public. One editor wrote bluntly, "Even if true, what use is reopening a case a century old? The culprits are long dead, and survivors' families long moved on." But Alina Rodriguez refused to see her years of work buried again. She self-published, lectured at historical gatherings, and spoke at community events throughout Alaska. Gradually, other researchers took interest, corroborating her discoveries with newly surfaced letters and forgotten records. Today, her work is reshaping historians' understanding not only of the Palm Sunday avalanche, but of the entire fabric of corporate violence. Shadowing the Klondike Gold Rush, Deja did not become a ghost town. Through economic decline or transportation shifts, Sit was abandoned by a community who learned that their very lives were expendable to ruthless businessmen. The truth about Deja endures as a reminder that some ghost towns are haunted not by phantoms of myth, but by the relentless ghosts of greed, murder, and corruption, echoing through history's silence. Every summer, the Henderson family would gather for their reunion in Juneau. But in 2019, Grandmother Ruth finally confessed why she had always refused to step foot near the Treadwell ruins across the channel. What she revealed about the mine disaster of 1917 would forever alter her family's understanding of their own history, and why certain echoes in the night still caused her to wake up screaming. Ruth Henderson was 87 years old when her grandson, David, suggested they add the Treadwell Historic Trail to the reunion's activities. He argued it would be educational, and it's practically across the water. "We've been coming to Juneau for 2 decades, and none of us have ever set foot in the ruins." Ruth's response had been immediate and final. "Absolutely not," she declared, her voice ringing with a certainty that stunned everyone. That place was forbidden. For years, the family had learned to accept Ruth's inexplicable refusal, chalking it up to the hesitations of an elderly woman who disliked rough trails, or perhaps carried some unspoken superstition about abandoned sites. But in 2019, with her health failing and aware she might not have many reunions left, Ruth made a choice that would burden her descendants for generations. "I must tell you something about Treadwell," she announced at their traditional Saturday dinner at the Twisted Fish Company. "Something about why that place has haunted our family for more than a century." David, the youngest grandson and a reporter with the Anchorage Daily News, immediately lifted his phone to record her words. Ruth noticed, gave a faint nod, and continued. "My great-grandfather was Thomas Anderson," she began, voice steady, though her fingers trembled. "He left Sweden for Alaska in 1903 to work in the Treadwell mines. Official accounts claim he perished in the catastrophic cave-in and flooding of April 1917, but that is not the truth. Thomas Anderson was already dead weeks before the collapse, murdered to silence him after he uncovered something that would have destroyed the company if revealed." Asterisk from her purse. Ruth withdrew a small leather pouch, unfamiliar to anyone at the table. Inside were oil-wrapped papers, letters in Swedish, company reports, and official-looking documents. "These were hidden in the walls of Thomas's boarding house," Ruth said. "When the building was torn down in 1923, his roommate found them and gave them to my grandmother. She never showed them, terrified of what might happen if the truth reached the wrong ears." According to Ruth's translation of Thomas's letters to his brother in Sweden, the Treadwell operation had been employing children in its most perilous shafts as early as 1905. Boys no older than 10 were forced into the narrowest. The company recruited them from orphanages in Seattle and San Francisco. Ruth read aloud from a letter dated November 1915. The boys had been promised education and training, but instead labored 14-hour shifts in deadly conditions. Thomas recorded that in his 12 years at Treadwell, he had personally seen at least 60 children killed in accidents, their deaths erased from official records. Yet even this was not the worst of what he had uncovered. In early 1917, Thomas discovered that the structural integrity of the mines was far worse than management admitted to investors or regulators. The supporting pillars were failing throughout the complex, and engineers had repeatedly warned that a total collapse was inevitable. Thomas wrote that the company faced three choices: spend millions reinforcing the tunnels, begin a gradual shutdown and evacuation, or deliberately engineer a disaster that would wipe out incriminating evidence of child labor while securing an insurance payout. Ruth's voice hardened. They chose the third. David looked up sharply from his recording. Are you saying the collapse was staged? Ruth's grim nod was answer enough. Thomas had witnessed engineers placing explosives in load-bearing pillars, disguised as reinforcements. When he confronted his supervisor, he was told to keep silent and sent to a new assignment. Suspicious. He tracked work orders and noticed a pattern. Adult miners were being shifted out of the explosive zones, but children were still being sent into them daily. Thomas realized then the truth. The collapse was designed not only to cover up violations, but to bury the children alive, ensuring no witnesses remained. Unable to stand by, Thomas wrote a detailed letter to federal authorities in Seattle on March 20, 1917, outlining both the illegal child labor and the deliberate plan for a catastrophic collapse. Ruth produced a carbon copy of the letter, yellowed but readable. David read it aloud. To the Federal Mining Safety Commission, I report grave violations of labor law and imminent danger at Treadwell Mines. Miners as young as 10 are forced into hazardous work, resulting in many deaths. Further, I have proof that company engineers are preparing a collapse to erase this evidence and silence survivors. I urge immediate investigation to prevent loss of life. But the letter never reached Seattle. It was intercepted by a company's security man and handed directly to management. 3 days later, Thomas was summoned by Superintendent John Kinsey. On March 23rd, he wrote his brother one last time. Ruth unfolded the fragile page. He had feared for his safety, but believed he could persuade Kinsey to call off the plan. That letter, found hidden under his mattress, revealed the full scale of corruption. For more than a decade, the company had covered up child deaths, bribed territorial officials, and manipulated insurance contracts. The April 1917 disaster was to be the capstone of their scheme, a staged catastrophe that would obliterate evidence while enriching them through claims. Kinsey had offered Thomas a promotion and transfer to Chile in exchange for silence. When Thomas refused, Kinsey warned that men who challenged the company often met untimely deaths. On March 25, 1917, Thomas Anderson was discovered dead in his boarding house. Official records listed a heart attack, but his roommate swore the body bore signs of a severe beating. No inquiry was made, and Thomas was hastily buried in Douglas Cemetery. His murder did not halt the scheme. On April 21st, charges planted across the mines were detonated during a shift change, flooding the tunnels exactly as planned. But one element went awry. Several dozen children, expected to be trapped and silenced forever, had been pulled to safety by a supervisor named Carl Magnusson, who had grown suspicious of the company. Magnusson, Ruth revealed, had been a close friend of Thomas Anderson. After Thomas died, Carl uncovered the concealed letters and grasped the full extent of the company's scheme. On the night of the collapse, he had defied orders and pulled every child laborer out of the most dangerous sections before the explosives were set off. The official line insisted only horses and mules perished in the cave-in, but that was false. Ruth insisted that at least 23 children had been killed that night, trapped in pockets that flooded too fast for escape. Their remains were never retrieved because the company made no attempt to search for them. According to the official records, those children had never existed. Carl Magnusson tried to take the truth to federal authorities, but he suffered the same fate as Thomas Anderson. 3 weeks after the disaster, he was discovered dead in a mining accident, crushed by machinery that supposedly failed while he worked alone. The surviving children from the cave-in were dispersed to other mines across Alaska. Ruth went on, they were threatened with death if they ever spoke of what happened at Treadwell, and most were too shattered to tell anyone. But one of them was a 10-year-old boy named Eric Anderson, Thomas Anderson's grandsons, to Treadwell after his parents died in a Seattle fire. Ruth stopped to dab her eyes before she continued. Eric lived because Carl Magnuson pulled him from the flooded sections. But the rest of his life, he was tormented by the memory of the children who drowned. He heard them crying in his sleep, calling from under the water. That is why I have always refused to visit the Treadwell ruins. Those children remain down there, still calling for someone to speak for them. David halted his recording, staring at his grandmother in disbelief. Do you have anything beyond Thomas's letters to prove this? He asked. Ruth reached into her purse and produced a small metal Tagarix identification tag from the Treadwell Mining Company. Child laborers were issued those tags so their bodies could be identified if they died. Eric kept his for his whole life as a reminder of the friends he'd lost. The tag read, Treadwell Mines, Child Worker, 247E, Anderson, 1917. The company always denied using child labor, Ruth said, but they kept records like everything else. Those tags are proof of their crimes, which is why they wanted to bury the evidence under millions of tons of seawater. Ruth's disclosures reframed the Treadwell collapse entirely. What historians had labeled a tragic geological failure was, she argued, an orchestrated massacre meant to conceal decades of child exploitation and to silence anyone who could expose the company. After the cave-in, the Treadwell firm collected more than $2 million in insurance payouts. Money, Ruth claimed, was reinvested to expand operations in countries with laxer labor laws. The children who perished in the flooded workings were erased, their names struck from records. Families told they'd run away or been reassigned. David asked if she'd ever thought of going public. Ruth shook her head. Who would believe it? What would it change now? The culprits were dead, and the company had long since dissolved. Still, she said, she wanted him to know the truth about their family and why some places should remain alone. Those children are still down there, she insisted, and they deserve rest. The Hendersons sat in stunned silence as Ruth finished. David found himself picturing the tourists who wandered the Treadwell ruins each summer, snapping photos and gazing across Gastono Channel Lunaware. They were treading over a mass grave. That the scenic decay marked one of America's worst corporate atrocities. Ruth Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep 6 months later, bearing with her the burden a family had carried for 4 generations. But she had fulfilled her promise to her grandfather, Eric, ensuring someone finally knew the truth about the children lost in the Treadwell mines. The Hendersons never visited the ruins at family reunions, yet on still summer nights, when wind crossed Gastineau Channel, David sometimes thought he heard something carried across the water from Douglas Island, the faint echo of children calling, deep beneath the drowned ruins, still waiting to be brought home. Jake Morrison was scraping by when he accepted a demolition contract on the Buckner building in 2018. The city told him they needed preliminary work. They did not say what he might uncover. Jake had spent 15 years in Alaskan construction, removing hazardous materials from derelict structures, comfortable with asbestos, lead paint, and collapsing floors. When the city asked him to assess the Buckner's lower levels, he assumed it would be another routine job. The Buckner loomed over Whittier since 1953, a 6-story, nearly 500-foot-long city under one roof, built by the Army to house over 1,000 military personnel and families during the Cold War. Abandoned after 1960, it had been rotting for decades. Jake's brief was simplest as structure, catalog hazards, and estimate demolition costs so the city could redevelop prime waterfront land. But what should have been a 2-day survey turned into something that would haunt him forever. From his first walkthrough of the basements, something felt wrong. He'd been told the lower floors were flooded from years of leaks and neglect, but the water he found was not stagnant. It moved as if pumped through a filtration system. The water was unnaturally clear. It should have been filthy after sitting in concrete for 60 years, Jake later told investigators. But it looked actively maintained. There were underwater lights dim, but working. When I tested circuits that were supposed to be dead, some were still powered. He photographed everything and sent a preliminary report. Instead, a man identifying himself as Dr. Richard Vasquez from the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation phoned him. Dr. Vasquez said certain Buckner areas contained classified military materials, and that Jake's remit had expanded to include documentation and secure removal under federal oversight. The pay bump made Jake keep his questions to himself at first, as he followed Dr. Vasquez's direction into restricted areas. He found the military had left more than simple hazardous remnants. Behind fake walls and sealed doors were labs' abandoned mid-use equipment, still plugged in. Experiments interrupted rather than concluded. The first lab was behind a surreptitious wall in the old medical wing. Examination tables with restraints, monitoring devices still recording, tanks of preservative fluid. Dr. Vasquez insisted it was leftover. Cold War biological research, and needed to be logged and removed. Jake cataloged 3 days' worth of photos before Dr. Vasquez and a federal team arrived to take sensitive materials away. But Jake had seen enough in construction to spot when something didn't fit. Much of the gear didn't look 60 years old. Monitoring units had LCD screens and USB ports. Some computers ran modern OS. When he pointed this out, Dr. Vasquez explained the equipment had been upgraded for security and told him not to pry. Jake didn't stop. After federal teams removed items from that lab, he snooped through other areas on his own time, hunting for more hidden spaces. What he uncovered in the basements rewired his sense of the building. There was a floor absent from all original blueprints, reachable only by a service elevator requiring a special keycard. Jake managed to jury-rig the elevator and found a functioning facility, fresh air systems, clean water, current food supplies, and labs resembling a modern research hospital. The subterranean complex contained dozens of rooms linked by sterile corridors with climate controls, sleeping quarters showing recent occupancy, conference rooms with whiteboards packed with formulas, and a central computer system actively monitoring experiments. The observation rooms were the worst, one-way mirrors into chambers clearly designed for human subjects, some outfitted with IVs, monitors, and machines Jake couldn't name. Logbooks recorded experiments from the 1960s up to recent years. Whatever the Army had done there did not stop in 1960. He photographed as much as possible, but when he tried to upload images, they wouldn't sync. Inside the building, his cell service died. I realized I was being monitored. He said cameras in every room, controlled access, communications blocked. When he tried to leave by the main doors, they were electronically locked. He lacked the keypad code. He was effectively trapped inside with proof of ongoing illegal human experimentation. Jake spent 2 days avoiding the facility's occupied areas and searching for an escape. He finally crawled through a damaged section of exterior wall and made his way out. But not before one last discovery that would trouble him for years: the morgue. In the basement, connected to the underground labs, he found freezer units full of bodies, some recent enough to be inconsistent with a 1960 abandonment. ID tags listed names and dates from the past few years people reported missing across Alaska. He photographed as many tags as he could and fled. Once free, Jake contacted the Alaska State Police and the FBI. But when investigators arrived the next day, the hidden facility had been scrubbed clean, labs emptied, computer systems removed, morgue spotless. Dr. Vasquez called that night and said I'd been duped, Jake recalled. He told Jake, Urban explorers had staged horror sets inside the abandoned building and offered him a sizable bonus, plus a confidentiality agreement to keep quiet. Jake refused to sign. He knew the difference between props and real medical devices. He began digging into the Buckner's history and discovered Army records showing psychological warfare research at the Whittier site from 1953 to at least 1975, studies of mind control, sensory deprivation, and manipulation intended for enemy prisoners or defectors. The program had been part of a classified network across multiple Alaskan bases. Jake's work indicated the program never truly ended. Rather, it was handed over to civilian contractors who continued the experiments under new funding arrangements. The Buckner had been maintained as an active research center for more than 6 decades, hidden in plain sight as an abandoned facility. The city's motive for demolition, he concluded, wasn't aesthetic. Officials wanted the building taken down to erase evidence before it could become public. His role was not demolition, but documentation cataloging what needed to be removed prior to the structure's destruction. Jake submitted his findings to government agencies, media outlets, and human rights organizations. Most dismissed his reports as conspiracy-minded, or the hallucinations of a man exposed to toxic old buildings. But a handful of investigators began to probe the disappearances he'd logged, and disturbing patterns started to emerge. Over the last 2 decades, Jake uncovered that more than 40 individuals had mysteriously vanished from communities located within a 100-mile radius of Whittier. Most of the missing were transients, homeless people, or individuals without close family ties, meaning their absence was not immediately noticed or reported. The disappearances occurred sporadically over time and across multiple jurisdictions, which prevented anyone from connecting the cases to a single place or organized effort. Eventually, the Alaska State Police launched an inquiry into the missing persons, but their investigation into the Buckner building was halted when federal agencies intervened, insisting that the site contained classified materials off-limits to anyone without proper clearance. Today, the Buckner building still stands, now encircled by freshly erected fencing and new security cameras that appeared soon after Jake Morrison's findings became public. "I know what I saw inside that building," Jake concluded grimly. He warned that people were still being kept in underground facilities throughout Alaska, and that the Buckner structure was only one node in a broader network of hidden sites where unlawful human experimentation continued under the cloak of government protection. Though the Cold War had ended, the programs it spawned had not disappeared. Instead, they had been expanded and perfected with the aid of modern technology. Jake left Alaska in 2019, but he has never stopped investigating covert military experimentation and pushing for justice on behalf of the families of missing people who may have been consumed by these operations. His work has documented similar black sites at other abandoned military complexes across the United States, suggesting that Buckner was just one disturbing fragment of a far larger and darker system of governance. Sanctioned human rights abuses. The most horrifying reality of the Buckner building, Jake insisted, was not what had happened there in the past. It was what was still taking place within its walls today, protected by layers of red tape, security classifications, and bureaucratic obfuscation. These programs thrived unchecked because those in authority had deemed certain lives expendable for the sake of national security. The Buckner structure remained a stark monument to the sinister edge of American military ambition, a slab of concrete testifying to the human cost of experiments that should never have been permitted. And if Jake was correct, the building had not been reduced to ruins or history. It was still fulfilling its true purpose, not as soldier housing, but as a laboratory where human limits were pushed by people who had long forgotten that their test subjects were once children, parents, and loved ones. Today, curious tourists passing through Whittier often pause to photograph the looming structure, marveling at its brutalist design and speculating about life in what was once a self-contained military city. Yet, if Jake Morrison's warnings are true, these visitors are not capturing images of a derelict Cold War relic. They are, instead, standing before an active crime scene, a place where unspeakable acts continue in silence. Shrouded by concrete and secrecy, when DNA testing linked Amy Kennecott to relatives from King Island, her joy quickly turned to shock as she uncovered the painful truth of why her great-grandmother had never spoken about the village of Ukavak. What Amy unearthed through her genealogy journey revealed a government scheme so deliberate and merciless that it wiped out an entire community, leaving behind only skeletal homes clinging to sea cliffs and the echoes of cultural erasure. Though Amy always knew she was in Newpit, her family's story had been fractured by silence and unspoken trauma that older generations carried but would not discuss. In 2019, she submitted her DNA to Ancestry in hopes of piecing together her family tree and connecting with distant kin. Instead, she stumbled into a revelation that transformed her understanding of her ancestry and exposed one of the coldest acts of cultural destruction in Alaskan history. The results revealed close ties to people with last names like Yatengak, Pikangana, and Pushik, names Amy had never encountered before, yet they stirred something deep within her genetic memory. Reaching out to her matches, she learned that they descended from a people once rooted on a small, rocky island in the Bering Sea, called Ukavak, or King Island, in a cliffside settlement known as When she asked her grandmother, the woman's face filled with unbearable sorrow, and she whispered, "That is a place we do not talk about. Some wounds are too deep to ever heal." But Amy could not stop searching. The DNA connections were undeniable, and she was determined to understand why her family had buried this past so completely. Her research revealed that Ukavak had been an extraordinary place, a village perched on stilts above treacherous cliffs, where the Ujavang had survived for centuries by honing remarkable hunting and crafting skills in one of Earth's harshest climates. Yet, she also learned that the village was abandoned in the late 1960s, with its entire population forcibly relocated to mainland Alaska. The official record claimed the Bureau of Indian Affairs shut the school in 1959 over safety concerns about a looming boulder threatening the structure, prompting families to move so their children could be educated on the mainland. On paper, it appeared a rational decision, Amy explained, but as she spoke with descendants of Ukavak's people, she heard another, darker version: stories of children taken under cover of night, of families threatened with the loss of government aid if they refused to leave, of a culture deliberately dismantled by officials who saw their traditions as an obstacle to modernization. Amy's most crucial discovery came through meeting Ela Lahner, an elder in Nome who had been born on King Island in 1943. For decades, Ela Lahner had buried her childhood memories, but when Amy explained her kinship, she finally chose to unburden herself. She revealed that the school's closure had never been about safety, had been about erasing the Ujuvin midway of life and forcing assimilation into Western society. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had quietly planned to dismantle remote, native villages as part of a so-called modernization campaign, and Ukavak was chosen as a test case precisely because its isolation meant few outsiders would notice. Federal officials arrived in 1958, informing the island's leaders that their school would no longer be recognized and that their children must be educated on the mainland if they wished to advance. When elders objected, noting their children already studied both English and Inupiat, they were dismissed. The agents coldly declared that native education held no legitimacy in federal eyes. Families who resisted, Ela Lahner recalled, were threatened with the loss of food aid, medical services, and basic support that many had grown dependent upon. Amy's research confirmed what survivors had long whispered, that Ukavak had not simply faded away, but had been deliberately destroyed by government design. But the full, extent of the conspiracy only became apparent when Amy came across a series of government files that had been quietly declassified during the 1990s as part of congressional inquiries into federal policy toward Alaska Natives. These files revealed that the shutdown of Yukavok had not been an isolated decision, but rather a deliberate component of a larger program known as the Alaska Native Settlement Initiative, a project designed to consolidate indigenous populations into specific government-approved communities where they could be more easily monitored, assimilated, and controlled. The contents of the documents were chilling, Amy explained to me. Within them were internal memos that outlined methods for dismantling traditional villages, step-by-step strategies for neutralizing resistance from tribal elders, and cold economic breakdowns of the costs and supposed benefits of removing families from their ancestral homelands. The language of the bureaucrats was dehumanizing, as if Alaska Native families were herds of livestock to be relocated into more manageable enclosures. One particularly disturbing memorandum, dated March of 1959, directly referenced the planned closure of Yukavok. It stated, "The King Island settlement represents a prime opportunity for testing relocation protocols. Its geographical isolation reduces the risk of negative publicity, and the small population size makes it possible to closely evaluate the effectiveness of psychological persuasion techniques. If successful, the King Island model can be replicated in other resistant Native communities across Alaska." Amy learned that these so-called persuasion techniques included restricting access to medical aid, halting delivery of mail, and spreading rumors among nearby mainland towns that the Yuzhavamiat carried contagious diseases when certain families resisted moving. Federal officials escalated matters, removing children from the island and sending them to distant boarding schools, telling parents that they would only be allowed visitation if they themselves permanently resettled in government-approved towns. "Eleanor told me about the night the agents came for the children," Amy continued, her voice trembling with emotion. Federal personnel arrived aboard a Coast Guard vessel in the middle of a raging storm, insisting they were conducting an emergency medical evacuation, but instead of care, they seized all of the children older than 6 years, herding them onto the ship while terrified parents protested. Mothers and fathers who attempted to fight back were threatened with arrest for obstructing federal authorities. The shoreline was filled with the children screaming for their parents, the parents screaming for their children while the agents carried on as though they heard nothing. Those children were then dispersed among boarding schools across Alaska and even to institutions in the lower 48, where they were forbidden to speak the Nupiat language and brutally punished for practicing their culture. Many never returned home, their ties to their families and communities severed beyond repair. Eleanor herself had been one of those children. Amy revealed that she had been only 7 years old when she was forcibly taken to a boarding school in Sitka. For the first year, she cried herself to sleep every night, convinced her parents would eventually come to rescue her. But as time passed, the administrators broke her spirit, convincing her that her parents had chosen to abandon her, that they cared more for their primitive traditions than for her future. The indoctrination was systematic. The children were repeatedly told their parents were ignorant and backwards, that their old ways trapped them in poverty, and that they should be grateful to the government for saving them. Over time, many began to believe it. This engineered shame created an entire generation of Alaska Natives who felt alienated from their heritage, too embarrassed or damaged to return to their ancestral villages even once they were grown. Meanwhile, those who had remained in Yukavok found it increasingly impossible to sustain their subsistence way of life. Without their children and younger generations, the population dwindled, families relocating one by one, until by 1970 the island stood empty. The cruelest irony, Amy pointed out, was that the enormous boulder the government had claimed posed an imminent danger to the schoolhouse never moved at all. When some of the displaced villagers revisited Yukavok during the 1980s, they found the rock in the exact same spot and the school building still intact. The safety justification had been nothing but a calculated fabrication, a legal pretext to cover what was, in truth, an act of cultural erasure. Amy's continued research uncovered evidence that this same pattern of tactics was employed to eliminate dozens of traditional Alaska Native villages during the 1950s and 1960s. Each time, officials would concoct a crisis or declare a hazard, then deliberately cut off the social and economic lifelines of the community until relocation became inevitable. The formula was always the same, Amy explained. First came the removal of essential services, healthcare, postal routes, supply deliveries to make daily existence unbearable. Then came the removal of children, under one pretense or another, tearing apart the emotional fabric of the community. Finally, relocation assistance would be offered, presented as voluntary, but with the clear message that refusal meant the loss of all federal support and the risk of legal reprisals. The long shadow of this program lingers even now. Families like Amy's lost their homelands, their cultural ties disrupted, while generations inherited trauma that the government never acknowledged or addressed. Eleanor herself admitted that she was haunted by Yukavok in her dreams for decades. She would see the houses standing on stilts, hear the roar of the ocean, and picture the faces of elders who were forever lost to her. Yet, she confessed, she had been too afraid to speak openly, conditioned to believe that longing for what began as Amy's personal genealogy search transformed into something much greater, a quest for cultural healing. In 2020, she organized the first gathering of Yukavok descendants in over half a century, reuniting individuals who had been scattered across Alaska and beyond. When they finally came face to face, some recognized family features immediately, even without introductions. Eleanor looked at one man and said, "You have your grandfather's eyes," Amy recalled. His grandfather had died on King Island 6 decades earlier. But the blood ties remained strong, despite the severed cultural links. The gathering became both a celebration and a reckoning. Elders unburdened themselves of memories they had carried in silence, while younger generations absorbed stories of a heritage long buried. At the same time, the event became a forum to confront the continuing impact of relocation policies, to acknowledge that what happened to Yukavok was not ancient history but a wound still bleeding. The same institutions that dismantled our village are still making decisions about Native communities today, Amy said. They continue to treat our traditions as obstacles to be erased, until there is truth, accountability, and recognition of what was done. Nothing stops this from happening again. Amy Kennecott's search had uncovered not just genealogy, but a record of survival against cultural genocide. It exposed a calculated campaign of cultural erasure that had been concealed from the public eye for more than 6 decades. The deserted dwellings of Yukavok, still clinging precariously to their cliffside ledges, remain as silent monuments to a people who refused to vanish entirely, kept alive within the memories and bloodlines of descendants now prepared to reclaim their narrative. Every time I examine my DNA connections, I see the surnames of those who should have grown up on you, who should have learned to stalk walrus across the sea ice and collect seabird eggs from the cliffs, who should have spoken Inupiaq as their first tongue, Amy explained. Instead, they were scattered across the country and conditioned to forget who they had once been. Yet DNA does not fabricate, and neither do the testimonies of the elders who endured. Yukavok may stand abandoned, a ghost town, but the Yukavok people endure, and we will not allow our past to be buried in silence. The history of Yukavok serves as a powerful reminder that ghost towns do not always come into being because of collapsing economies or natural calamities. At times, they are created through intentional strategies meant to annihilate entire cultures and lifeways. But it also illustrates the endurance of communities that resist obliteration, even when powerful forces plot to make them vanish. The earthquake photographs were intended as nothing more than standard disaster documentation. Yet, while curator Diana Walsh was preparing the 1964 Portage exhibition, She noticed details lurking in the background of several images that chilled her to the core. What she uncovered suggested that the most catastrophic earthquake in North America's history had been preceded by supernatural phenomena so disturbing that government